Well, hi folks, and welcome to episode 183. I nearly said 133. 183 of Retro Power Uncut. And there's a sun somewhere behind some cloud in the sky, so we've got the door up, which is, it must be about 6 months since we've had the door open for a video, at least. So yeah, finally feels like we've got a bit of warmth and it's stopped raining for 5 minutes. Anyway, on to the workshop rather than the weather. We're going to start with Interceptor, and Stu's been beavering away with a whole variety of little tasks this week. The biggest and most obvious one being our new wooden fuel tank. We've decided that we're not going to use aluminium for fuel tanks anymore. It's a lot easier to make them in wood, so we've decided that plywood's the way to go. Nice epoxy lining in it, and it'll be absolutely perfectly serviceable and in keeping with a period vehicle. No, back to reality. Stu was after some decent cardboard for mocking up a fuel tank, and I pointed out that we had quite a leftover pile of thin 4 or 5 mil thick plywood. So that would actually make a really nice job of doing a temporary fuel tank, because it's a bit more sturdy than cardboard. So Stu's done a plywood fuel tank, just so that because the clearances are quite tight in a few places around the tank, it just makes life a little bit easier. This will all be drawn up on CAD, and then Concept Racing, as usual, will make us the final tank. But it's nice to have a mock-up one, just to check the clearances, make sure everything fits, check for space. Particularly, it's hard to show now. I can't really show you now, but there'll be bits of footage, I'm sure. But basically, on top of the tank, there's an infill panel that's going to prevent dirt piling up on top of the tank, because the whole of the tank is underneath the car, closed off by a panel. And we're bulkheading all of the fluid lines through the panel above the tank, and the fuel filter is going to mount there as well. And because of that, just to check on the clearances, it's best to have an actual fuel tank in place, just to make life a bit easier. It's either that, or we've got to scan everything, draw it all up in CAD, and then draw everything to make sure everything fits, which is a bit of a heavy-handed way of achieving the end result. So Stu's beavered away, made us a nice wooden tank, and he's sussed the fuel line routing, and then further to that, in order to accommodate that, he has then put these nice oval cutouts and round cutouts, because the brake line routing as well, through the chassis sections, to allow the pipes to run adjacent to the chassis rail, out of the way of the exhausts, out of the way of the prop shaft, out of the way of the ground. Nice safe area. He profiled them so they're nice and neat, and they will accommodate the fittings on the end of the AN6, the Dash 6 fuel lines. Make the holes big enough to take the actual hexagons of the fittings on the ends, which means we don't have to put the fittings on after the lines are through the holes, which makes life a lot easier. So that's why the holes are fairly big, so the actual hex fittings will go through them. So that's what's happened there. He's then worked out positioning for the fuel pressure regulator, although we were struggling to find our mock-up fuel pressure regulator. That was the last thing I spoke to Stu about, was that we seem to be struggling to find it, so it's disappeared somewhere. We'll find our mock-up fuel pressure regulator shortly, so that he can get that mounted in the engine bay and suss the line routing to and from that regulator. Additional, whilst talking about routings, he's also been looking at the exhaust setup. He's chucked the front sections of the main system on, so that he could work out the path at the back, work out all the bends required, and work out the space available for the silencers, work out the distances taken up by the bends, and therefore the lengths of silencers that will fit in the space, so that we can order all the silencers. We want this car to be quite quiet, actually. It needs to be quite refined, because it's going to be a long distance cruiser, not a sports car. It needs to be reasonably quiet, and to that end it's getting quite a lot of silencing. Fortunately, we've got quite a lot of space at the back, behind the fuel tank and in front of the rear valance. We've got quite a big chunk of space, so Stu's come up with a master plan to put a number of silencers in there. We were thinking about fabricating one very large silencer with both sides of the system running through it. Actually, we've had a change of heart and decided to do multiple silencers, so that we maximise the length of perforated tube in them, at the possible sacrifice of a little bit of silencer life, in that the thickness of packing will be reduced a little bit. So the silencers may need replacing more often, but they'll be quieter for that period. Obviously, until they're worn out and the packings come out, they'll be quieter in that period. I just think it'll be a better end result doing it that way. It's Stu's idea, and actually he's quite right. It's going to be a better solution. Obviously there's the trailing arms that we covered last week. That's all finalised now. Just obviously the finish welding still to do on all of this. We don't want to be trying to do the finish welding upside down. The wishbones are going to be TIG welded anyway, so they're just tacked up. They'll be cleaned up or wire brushed and TIG welded on the bench. And then the finish welding all around the mountings is going to be done once the car's on the on the rollover setup. We're not quite finalised on exactly how that's going to work yet, but when we roll it over to do the underside finishing, then we'll do the finish welding on all of that. And as I've said before, the diff mount isn't finished yet, so ahead of anybody commenting, that's just ready for final welding on the bench. Stu's now moved on to sorting out the wiring for the starter motor and alternator, because that was reversed. The wiring loom was the wrong way round for the setup on the car, which we think had been swapped over due to the transmission that had been chosen. So Stu's been modifying that so we can get the wiring routed, and he's literally currently, this moment, got a fuel filter in his hands, going back to the fuel system because he's working out the mounting for the fuel filter onto that little bulkhead panel above the tank. So that's where we're at with all that. I think I'll pause at that point and talk briefly about new machinery, because not new, very old machinery, as usual, when I'm involved, and when our budget, which I have a few comments occasionally from people saying, why are you always buying old machinery? Why don't you just buy some decent stuff? There's two sides to that. One, the old machinery is often better, and two, we can't really afford to buy new machinery. If we were just a fabrication workshop, it'd be quite simple. I could just buy nice new fabrication machinery for everything and it'd be great. The downside is we are not just a fabrication workshop, we do everything. We do the entire car build on site. So we need machinery to do all of the jobs involved with building a car on this one site, which means that our outlay on machinery to undertake work is vast, and I can't really justify the expenditure of buying brand new machinery for everything, because we just couldn't afford it. We would no longer exist. But I have managed to buy a couple of pieces of machinery, a Bronx press brake, which is sat at the other end of the workshop. We've been wanting a press brake for quite a while. That's sorted out now, and also whilst buying that, the same guy had a 2.5 metre Edwards direct drive guillotine. So I've also bought that as well. I haven't actually physically got room in the unit for that at the moment, so that's sheeted up outside, awaiting a big move round, yet another one, to enable me to actually get that into the unit. So that's going to have to just wait for the moment. I just don't have anywhere to put it. But that will hopefully, all being well, once we've tested it and made sure everything's okay, because it's not really tested, that machine. That was kind of bought as seen, but it was at a price where bought as seen is a risk worth taking. But we've got to get that in, wire it up temporarily, test it, make sure everything's good, probably get the blade sharpened once I've verified that it operates as it should. Then we'll get the blades reground, and then I can get the move round done so that we can actually fit it in the unit. So that's all work that's got to be done, but we've got the press brake moved into place. Doug at Goldcrest Machinery in Nuneaton moved that for us, fetched that from the far side of Birmingham, brought that and the press brake, that and the guillotine, and a spare hydraulic pack for the press brake, and a load of spare tooling and all sorts of other things. Picked them all up from far side of Birmingham, can't remember, far side of Birmingham anyway. Brought all those over here. Impressive crane on his truck, bit of footage of that. It's a pretty impressive machine, that crane. And yeah, craned it off and then skated it all in. We've got that in, got that wired up, that's up and running. So yeah, we're pretty pleased with that. I've got to do some refining of the tooling. A couple of the tools have got a bit of damage on, but I've got a spare set of tooling with it. A couple of lumps in the road on making the other tooling fit, in that the close height's slightly different. So we've got to do some adjustments and things, but nothing too drastic. So yeah, hopefully you will see some footage fairly soon of press brake in action making some parts, which is the reason for getting it. Still haven't put the new bed on the plasma cutter, hoping to get that done later today. We shall see. And that's a bit of guarding that's no longer needed. The press brake was fitted quite far away from a wall, so it needed rear guarding. It's now fitted right up to a wall, so it doesn't need rear guarding. And in terms of maintenance, if I need to access the power pack, the wall is just single skin cladding, so I can just make a hole in the wall to access it. So it doesn't need rear guarding now because I can't actually get in at it. So I've taken that guard out just to get it out of the way.
Another handy wall hole.
Yeah, another handy wall hole. Yes, yeah, we do like a handy wall hole. Audi, a few little minor steps forward in the fabrication shop. I'm still working on sourcing parts. That's going along on the back burner. Cal will elaborate a little bit more next door on other progress on this, because there's a lot of non-physical metal progress going on. And the other side of the bit of progress that has been made in here is we're ascertaining the best route forward for the roof. Having found, I think I mentioned last week, having found the holes in the roof, Kelvin Welsh at Fusion Autocraft was quite right when he warned me that it would probably have holes in the roof. It has got holes in the roof. Despite the rest of the car being pretty much rust-free, the roof is not. He was quite right with his warning. So Matt has removed the original sunroof tray from the roof, de-spot welded that, unglued it and got that out from the roof so that we could ascertain how much space we have at the sides of the sunroof aperture for planishing welds, because the current plan is to make a new centre for the roof skin. That way we don't have to take the roof skin down into the gutters, but it does involve planishing a weld just between the roof frame and the sunroof, and there's about 10 millimetres of space there, which is not really enough. We're now looking at possibly removing the inner frame from the cantrail here, and taking that out, which might give us slightly more room for planishing that weld. But there's a secondary to that, is that Kelvin at Fusion Autocraft again messaged me yesterday to say he may have found a roof. He is working on a car, or has been working on a car for the same customer that we're working on this car for. So there's a bit of conversation backwards and forwards, and he thinks he may have found a roof, which if he has, it's sort of a he said, she said sort of thing at the moment. But if it is a good roof, if it's as good as it's claimed to be, then we may just get a new roof skin and fit that, or not new, a second-hand but rust-free roof skin and fit that. However, it needs looking at to check that it is rust-free, because they seem to be almost impossible to find without rust above the reinforcers that's gone up through the roof, which is what's happened to this. This car looked very good, but it's needless to say rusted up through the roof. It's due to a porous, a sort of a sponge-type adhesive which glues the roof skin to the roof reinforcer bars, and that absorbs condensation from the inside of the roof between the headlining and the roof when the car is parked in changing temperatures. You get condensation forming on the inside of the roof that's absorbed by the foam glue. The foam glue pulls the paint away from the inside of the roof, or there's no paint under it. I'm not sure whether the foam went on first. It may be that there's no paint even under it, but if there is paint on it, it pulls it away, and then the moisture is trapped against the steel by the foam adhesive and rots upwards through the roof from the inside. So by the time you find a pinhole on the outside, the inside's shot. It's a very common problem with cars with sunroofs and cars with foam glue in the roofs. Like my sort of past dealing with Opals, Opel Mantas are renowned for it. The sunroof tray is glued to the inside of the roof to stop it vibrating, again with a foam adhesive, absorbs condensation, rots up through the roof. And people say, oh, it's just got a little pinhole in the roof. And it's got a little pinhole in the roof is scrap, because there will be loads of corrosion from underneath, and the little pinholes are just where it's made its way all the way through. And Audi seems to be exactly the same every time. If there's a pinhole on the outside, the roof's scrap. So yeah, that's the case here. So we're just trying to work out a plan. Either we're going to graft a new section, wheel up a new section for the centre of the roof, and TIG will weld that in, or we're going to change the roof skin if this potential roof skin turns out to be rust-free. So that's where we're at with the Audi. So moving on from Quattro, we'll go over to Allegro, which is on its wheels. See, some significant progress has occurred here, because this was on the jig last week. And yeah, Bobby and Matt and Tom have been working on Allegros, plural, because there's been progress on both of them. But we'll stick with this one for the moment, which is the Project 2. It's the Lucky Strike 2, the second Allegro project, which has got to this stage first just because of the way things have gone. However, that all aside, yeah, Bobby's got the suspension back onto this. Bobby and Tom, at the tail end of last week, I think that was on Friday, got the quarters bonded on for the final time, all clamped up, about 1 million clamps involved. Tom's copious collection of welding clamps came in very handy, because it was clamped by every single clamp we own, I think, to hold those quarter panels in place. But that's all gone really well, everything's lined up nicely, alignment's all good, everything went to plan, everything fits, really good. So they're on. And then at the start of this week, Bobby and Tom got the doors fitted, the wings fitted, the bonnet fitted, got all the alignment of those done, and then temporarily fitted the door skins, got all the alignment set there, removed those, and Tom's cleaned up the inside of the doors. The car is basically new, this car. There was no rust at all inside the doors, which is perhaps surprising for an Austin Allegro, but it was in incredibly rust-free condition. It's a very, very low mileage car, basically new, so there was almost no rust at all inside the doors. So Tom's Y-wheeled those, cleaned them up nicely. They weren't worth blasting. There was no pitting, no rust at all to make it worth blasting them. So they've been Y-wheeled, and then Mark has epoxied the inside of those doors with the zinc-rich 2K epoxy primer. So they were then ready. Then the flanges around the outside of the doors have been belt sanded back to clean that off, get them back to bare metal for the bonding. Then the two-component epoxy panel bonding compound has been applied around those, and then the door skin's clamped on using some spreader strips to prevent them distorting, prevent them getting pull marks in them around the edges. And the panel bonder's gone off. Then the door gaps have been set and roughly sort of sanded and filed to shape. Wings refitted again, and all the panels aligned and checked for a final time. Then Bobby's got the door handle holes cut out and the front indicator stroke air intake holes cut out, the front wings. And then the ride height, Bobby's done some checks on the wheel travel, moving the suspension all the way through its travel. We've got some tubes fitted to the damper piston rods on the struts on all four corners to simulate approximate ride height, within sort of 10 mil or so what the final ride height will be. But Bobby's removed those tubes and then put the suspension all the way through its travel to check for clearance. He's also trimmed the arch lips back on all four wings, the quarters on the front wings. And then, yeah, put the suspension completely through its travel, through steering lock, just to check for clearance on everything, make sure everything's good there, which it is. And then now Matt is working on the front and rear bumpers on this car, modifying the bumpers to bring them closer into the body, narrowing them, moving them in closer, reprofiling the ends, shortening the ends, generally doing quite a bit of metal work on the bumpers, just getting those to fit how we want them to fit. And then we are pretty close to this going into the body shop. Obviously it's got to wait for its little space in the body shop. And there's a bit of work to go on. George has got to do some more scan work now, because we have the side skirts to do and the front splitter to do. And in order to do those, they were intentionally left to a second round of carbon fibre work, because it's one thing scanning the metal part of the body shell and then making the carbon fibre panel fit the metal part of the body shell. It's another thing doing that, making the carbon fibre part fit the metal part of the body shell, and then also getting another carbon fibre part to independently fit to that part and to another part of the body shell. That's a big ask. So what we've done is the initial lot of panels, and then George is going to scan the sill area and the front of the car so that he can then tweak the CAD for those panels. They are already drawn, but he's going to tweak the CAD for those to make them exactly fit the panels in their as bonded position, so there's less potential for a misfit of those parts. So that's still got to be done, and those panels have got to be made then. But yeah, this is pretty close to really being into the body shop now. And then continuing on the Allegro theme, car number 1, which is now mounted to the jig. That was fitted to the jig yesterday, I think. Was it yesterday? Yeah, day before maybe. I lose track of time. Yeah, that's now on the jig, and then it's basically a repeat of the same work. So Tommy and Bobby working on getting they've got the doors on, and then using the doors to finalise the quarter alignment, getting the quarters aligned. Once the quarters are aligned, Tom can finish building the inner wheel arches and the metalwork around the rear corners. He'd made a head start on that while the car was sort of lurking over in the corner of the workshop, while we were waiting for the opportunity to get this onto the jig when that car had cleared out of the way. So he's getting on with that metal work, and then basically all of the panel alignment is being sorted, the trimming back of the edges on these carbon quarters, and basically making everything fit. It's not a case of sort of throwing them on, as I think I've mentioned before. There's quite a lot of trimming, sanding, fiddling, finessing to be able to get those panels to fit. Nothing too outlandish, but just a lot of detail work to make them fit exactly. And that's what's going on with this now, and that'll be, again, next week will be a continuation of that theme, coupled with Tom building the inner arches and finishing the metalwork around the back. This car's actually quite a long way ahead in terms of metalwork compared to what you've seen with the previous car, because quite a lot has gone on this in parallel with the other car. Matt had been doing quite a lot of the detail work on this body, while the carbon work was progressing on that one. Also on this, Matt's also fettled the rear valance. There were various dents in the rear valance. This car had actually been in a minor rear end bump earlier in its life. Bear in mind, this car had been off the road since 1982. It had not been used. It's been parked in a garage since 1982. But it had had a replacement rear valance, and then the replacement valance had a few dents in it. So Matt's pulled those out dropping in the names again, but thanks Matt Stakes, using the bullseye pick that we have from Matt. Thoroughly recommend, if you're in the market for one, speak to Matt at Stakes. You'll have to ring him up, because I don't think he's put them on his website yet. Still, come on Matt. Ring Mr. Stakes up at Stakes' Metalwork Machinery, and if you want a bullseye pick, speak to him. I believe he has some. They're just not on his web shop. But they are very good, actually, for the money. They're extremely good. So yeah, Matt's been getting some dinks out of that rear panel, got all that sanded and prepped nicely, so that's all ready to go. So things are moving ahead nicely. So I say he's carrying on with the bumpers sort of just behind camera at the moment. So that's pretty much everything that's gone on in the fabrication shop. I think I'm pretty much talked out in here. I'm not going to elaborate any further. I'm not going to do any questions this week. I'm going to pick up a double dose of questions next week. And at that point, I'll hand over to Cal and see how things are going in the assembly shop.
Right, I'm back, woohoo! And the main thing I missed while I was on holiday was Roundstone Coffee. Look at the advertising pro. Right, back into it. James is making lots of plastic chips by the looks of it. So he's working on the final sections of the E-Type book. I think 2 weeks ago we showed all the MDF sections being cut, everything being assembled, interlocked together. Then there are some sections which are being done to actually hammer form over. Essentially the MDF matrix is just as a guide, if you will. So the panels will be hand wheeled and then put over the MDF book to check the shape until they can all be pinned in place and you can tell that they're the same shape as the book. With these sections, they're for anywhere there's a hard edge. So the main part is on the back around where the number plate aperture is and also around the wheel arches. We need to make a sort of tight crease in the metal in those areas. So the tool will actually be used to directly hammer the metal over in those places. So we need something more solid than MDF, because if you try and hammer metal over MDF, it just flattens the MDF. So these have been done in Halo S tooling board from a UK company called Rubik's, which is just a good, economical, seems reasonably expensive, but it is economical for what it is, material for this kind of thing. They use it for also machining moulds for composite parts, but it is hard enough. We've done a few tests with it before machining these parts, and it is hard enough to hammer form over. So hopefully that's going well, because it's not so bad with the MDF if you scrap a sheet. It's not particularly a big loss, whereas one of those big blocks is fairly expensive. Right, so that's that. We got the seats back for the Camaro. I think last week they probably showed the fact they had the doors off it. They were doing the wiring grommets for the doors. We're pretty much in a position now where I can put the glass in this, so I'm hoping like maybe early next week I'll get the front and rear screens bonded in. We can do the parcel shelf. I think we're in a position then to get the door cards in once this other door's back on. The seats are here and can go in. I've got to do the headlining, which I'll probably do after the glass. It's something that's a little bit different if you're not used to working on sort of American cars of this era. The way the headlinings are fitted, often on something like an Escort, and a lot of cars of that sort of 60s, 70s era in the UK, the headlining's actually wrapped around the window flanges and the door flanges, and then it's a rubber seal. So you put the headlining bows in, the metal bars, stretch it all into place, clip it all around the apertures. When you're happy with it, glue it on the apertures, and then the rubber seals go over the top. On these, there's a separate row of little frames underneath that screw in, and then you stretch the headlining over those, and then there's basically just like a rubber edging trim that goes over and kind of finishes the edge and clips it all in place. But consequently, it means that the headlining doesn't go around here, and the glass is actually bonded glass, a bit more like you do get on a modern car, except rather than having like the black obscuration band on the glass to hide the bond line, there's a series of stainless steel trims which obviously look pretty but also cover the bonding adhesive that you could see through the glass otherwise. So when I get to this, my nervousness is going to be getting the adhesive amount just right, that it seals all the way around, but that it doesn't squish inwards past the section that's covered by the stainless trim. That's what makes these a bit high jeopardy. You look at a lot of cars with bonded screens and you can just see the edge of the adhesive, so I'll no doubt I will be slightly nervous about that. Let's have a look at Mark 1 Escorts. So I'll start with Project Kuma, because Project 1 is now somewhere else, which we'll come on to in a minute. Moving on to this one, we're basically now just doing the assembly process that's already been done on Project 1, and because we'd duplicated everything, so all the machine parts, all the processes like anodizing, etc., have been duplicated from Project 1. So now we're moving on to this one. Things in theory should move reasonably slickly. So we're getting things like the door handle assemblies all built up and fitted, things like these 3D printed rings that the covers screw onto to cover the rear dampers. Dean's been up and taken away the trim panels which we'd already made, so the parcel shelf panel, the rear bulkhead panel, the floor panels that go in the back there. He's got all those panels so we can start leathering those. Interior was the carpet also. When Gibbo was cutting the sections for Project 1, he's also cut the carpet sections for this one. I think we've just got the boot sections left to do. But yeah, essentially it's going through the motions of doing all of the assembly work that we've already done on Project 1 and replicating it on this one using parts that are 99% ready to go. We're going to do the headlining shortly as well. I think that's been made. Dean's just going to drop that off imminently so we can get that in. And then we're waiting for the engine, which I must admit is slightly frustrating us here, is that it's been on order an awfully long time and we're still waiting for it, but I'm going to start putting the thumb screws on that pretty soon so we can crack on, get that in and get this one built. And then Project 1, we were pushing through the sort of final phases in the run up to testing, and so things like the wheel centre caps we got back through. We've done some little billet machined caps that are black anodised with a logo we actually used on a previous project, which I thought would be quite cool to repeat on these. It's like a Ford RS logo except it's RP. The cam cover fitment, and this was being done sort of in tandem with Alex working on some of the final mapping work. So I think last week we showed the engine being fired up for the first time. He's basically been going through the motions of getting it running enough to drive it around, basically, so it starts nicely, idles nicely, can be driven around the yard. The fueling's reasonably close to where it should be, just at idle and low load settings, just to get it usable, in advance of us taking it to do the first sort of stage of mapping, which will be on a rolling road. Rolling road will give us the opportunity to basically get it under load, test the drive line, basically make sure there's no horrendous vibrations, make sure the diff's good, the gearbox is good, all the gears shift as they should. If that's all good, we'll get it under load, start getting the engine mapping close to where it should be, and then that will be in advance of sort of phase 2 of the testing, which will be road testing, and that tends to be more to do with NVH, suspension feel, making sure the steering feels good, the controls feel good, the suspension feels good in different situations, and then we'll kind of work through that in advance of then probably a track session in the car, which will be where you start to push it a bit more and analyse the handling a bit more and start to tweak things like damper, compression and rebound settings and that sort of thing. So that's more or less where we're at with Project 1. There is a little bit of assembly left to do. So we've been through and done all the mechanical spanner checking work on the car now to get it safe for use. We've still just got a few details like sun visors, interior mirror needs to go in. We got the bumpers fitted up before it went away to be detailed. So yeah, in terms of the assembly of the car, it's pretty much there, and then we'll be straight into testing. So where it is now, as I've just alluded to, is over at Dale's place, detailed by Dale, essentially getting a good spruce up at this stage, getting the paint sort of perfected in terms of the final polishing, and getting a ceramic coating on there to protect it, so when we move into our testing phase, although we might put some protective film here and there on the car, it's nice to know that the paintwork's kind of got some chemical protection on it, such that light scratches and things just from getting dust and dirt on it and then wiping it off doesn't damage the paintwork. So it's over there being spruced up at the minute, and we can have a little look at that now.
Yeah.
So that's where Project 1's at. I'm really excited to see that back in the workshop next week. I imagine I'll be firing photos up on social media because I'll be super excited to see it all kind of looking together and perfect. I think the rest of what we've got to talk about actually relates generally to Quattro and the work that Luke and George are doing up in the CAD den at the minute. Then it's all Audi actually this week, I think, more or less. So 2 prongs of attack. George is on the body panels, so I think I mentioned last week actually, or the week before when I was here, that we'd done another scan of the Quattro with all of its, now it was on the jig with all its panels unpicked, so we could take the bodywork design from just being the outer shape to actually being complete individual panels with all of their reverse and mounting flanges, etc. on there. And so that's what he's on now basically, is designing the panels as complete panels that literally mate up to all the flanges of the inner shell. So then when we're ready to pull the trigger, we can get the tooling machine for those panels, and theoretically, and certainly fingers crossed, the panels that come out of those tools will mate up perfectly with the inner parts of the body shell. And then Luke is on with interior, so we're pretty much doing a completely scratch-made interior in it. He's on with the dash and centre console at the minute. It's heavily influenced by the original, and what we really wanted to keep, this little rotary control. Basically, the switches and controls on the side of the instrument panel are really nice. I love them, and they're quite a defining feature of the car. So I wanted to keep them, but we're switching to a Motec 12-inch digital display in the middle. So one of the jobs he's been doing is designing that whole instrument pod such that it will retain the original switches and twist controls, although some of them might have slightly different functions. But then incorporate the Motec screen in the middle, which will have multiple pages. We'll probably have a page on that display that looks like a replica of the original Quattro dash, but we'll be able to switch to different pages that might completely transform the appearance of the instrument display. And then the main dash, we're kind of simplifying it, keeping it really 90s looking. We're moving the vents because the 12-inch Motec and the switches are such that you can't get the offside vent on the dash anyway. So we're going to move the vents from the dash. We'll have little tweeter mounts at the top, some demist vents in there, and we're going to move the face vents slightly lower down to the lower section of dash. And then he's working on the central part at the minute, but it's only in the early stages. We'll have another little display in that central part of the dash, a little nod to the 4x4 or diff lock display that was originally on the Quattro down there, but kind of putting our own twist on it. So basically watch this space on that, but it's interior design phase going on at the minute, and that will then lead to the vast majority of parts being either CNC routed or CNC machined or 3D printed, and we'll watch it all coming together over the coming months and years. And I think on that note, I'm going to leave it for this week, and I'll see you again next week. Don't pick me up, human.
30 kilos of it, I reckon. I'm back in bed.